Since the war in Iran kicked off, we've heard a fair bit of talk about the so-called petrodollar. As we argued in a previous video, the significance of the petrodollar is often overstated, in large part because oil exporters like Saudi Arabia don't actually run massive surpluses anymore, so don't have many quote-unquote petrodollars to hand. There is, however, a new class of economies enjoying bumper surpluses at the moment, namely those that manufacture semiconductors, chips, or basically anything AI adjacent. And interestingly, there's now a fair bit of evidence to suggest that they're recycling these surpluses back into the US in much the same way that oil exporters did in the 70s and 80s. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the petrodollar, why it's been a boon for America, and why what we might call the AI dollar looks to be taking its place. Contrary to Trump's original talk of regime change, the war in Iran apparently cemented the Iranian regime's grip on power. In the latest issue of our magazine, we explain how this happened, and why it's too early to be pessimistic about the future of Iran. That's just one of the 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So let's start by explaining what the so-called petrodollar actually is. In short, petrodollars are US dollars received by oil exporting countries in exchange for their crude oil exports, which are generally denominated in dollars. The mere existence of petrodollars, in other words, the fact that the global oil trade is denominated in US dollars, has been good news for America, because it's created additional demand for US dollars and helped to establish the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. America benefited even more, however, from the fact that petrodollars were often spent on US assets, and specifically US government bonds, commonly known as treasuries, which were seen as a safe but interest-bearing asset. This is a process that's since become known as petrodollar recycling. Petrodollar recycling has helped keep American borrowing costs nice and low, and helped establish treasuries as the world's favorite form of debt. This was in turn good for the dollar's reserve status. The treasury status as the world's favorite form of debt, and the dollar's status as the world's favorite currency, became mutually reinforcing. The dollar's popularity made treasuries more appealing, because treasuries could be sold for dollars and paid dollar interest, while treasuries' popularity made the dollar more appealing because, well, you need dollars to buy treasuries. Now, petrodollar recycling was a big thing in the 70s and early 80s, because as global oil prices surged, oil exporting countries were suddenly flush with cash, which they then recycled into treasuries. At this time, the US was also a big oil importer, which is why it was seen as recycling. The US would spend dollars on Middle Eastern oil, and Middle Eastern countries would send these dollars back to the US in exchange for treasuries. However, petrodollar recycling isn't that much of a thing these days, for three reasons. First, thanks to the shale revolution, the US is now a net oil exporter, meaning that it doesn't really make sense to talk about recycling anymore. Second, lots of oil exporters aren't actually running massive surpluses anymore. The Saudis are probably the best example of this. While they do still rake in a lot of money from oil exports, the difference with the 70s is that today they're also spending a lot of money as they try and diversify away from oil. This means that the Saudis just don't have as much spare cash to invest in treasuries, as evidenced by the fact that they've been running both fiscal and trade deficits for the past couple of years. Third, there's evidence to suggest that those oil exporters that are still running large surpluses just aren't buying as many treasuries as they used to. You can see this if you look at how treasuries have moved in the past couple of weeks. In the past, treasuries have generally gone up during oil crises, both because oil exporters start recycling their new revenues into treasuries, and because treasuries used to be considered the archetypal safe asset, which means that demand goes up during times of turmoil. This time, however, this hasn't happened, and treasury yields have trended upwards since the war. Fortunately for the US, however, just as oil exporters have stopped running big surpluses and recycling them into treasuries, someone else has apparently stepped into the gap, namely chip exporters, who are suddenly flush with absurd amounts of cash. Thanks to the AI boom, economies that manufacture semiconductors and other AI-related equipment have experienced massive export booms, with many of these AI-related exports denominated in dollars. Importantly, however, this hasn't led to an equivalent surge in imports or a currency appreciation, which is what you would naturally expect to happen in the immediate aftermath of an export boom. After all, if you start exporting loads of stuff and earning lots of foreign currency, you can either spend that foreign currency on imports, or you can convert it into your domestic currency to buy more stuff at home, which should lead to a currency appreciation. So more imports and less exports, and eventually a balanced trade account. Taiwan and South Korea are probably the two most notable examples. Both economies have enjoyed unprecedented export-led booms recently, with Taiwan's driven by TSMC and South Korea's driven by Samsung and SK Hynix. However, despite these export booms, which you would usually expect to lead to a currency appreciation, both the Taiwan dollar and the South Korean won have actually fallen against the US dollar in recent months. This combination of an export boom but depreciating currency, which means less imports, has given way to some massive trade surpluses. In just the first 3 months of this year, Taiwan's current account surplus came in at $60 billion, and South Korea's at about $85 billion. This implies that Taiwan is currently running a trade deficit representing something like 25% of GDP, while South Korea is currently running one representing 15% of GDP. These are enormous. For context, China, which is widely considered the archetypal surplus economy, runs a trade surplus equivalent to only 4% of GDP. This strongly implies that instead of spending their AI dollars on either imports or domestic stuff, the economies are just recycling it back into foreign financial assets. And given the relative strength of the US dollar, stock market, and treasuries, probably American ones. The mechanisms by which this is all happening are a bit more complicated than things were with the petrodollar. Back then, it was just national governments redirecting oil revenues. Today, it's a combination of corporations, Taiwanese life insurance companies, and Korean day traders, to name just a few culprits. But the broad outlines are similar. Like their oil-centric predecessors, AI-centric economies are running surpluses so big that they don't know what to do with them, and are apparently plowing quite a lot of their new AI dollars back into the US. In lots of ways, this is great for America. This AI dollar recycling has helped the US keep borrowing costs low, the stock market high, and is one of the big reasons American companies are planning on issuing tons of new equity in the coming years. But it also makes the US economy even more reliant on AI than it already was, and thus even more vulnerable to an AI-related slowdown. The latest issue of our magazine is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I told you about one of the articles at the start of this video, but this issue is truly jam-packed with content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions that have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through our timeline, and reaching the ultimate question: has Trump created the modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss if Britain has become ungovernable. Then in our EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, while Europe's energy transition isn't what you'd expect, as well as looking at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss whether we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. That's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy today.